Right, now we're going to talk about secondary growth. Secondary growth occurs in eudicots. It's basically bark. It's going to be creating the structures that allow a plant to grow year after year. So these are plants that are growing year after year. Now, some monocots also grow year after year, but their secondary growth is a little bit different because we'll talk a little bit more about how they grow in the lab. But basically, we're going to focus this in on how eudicots do this. Now, there's two meristems that are involved that are very important. One is called the vascular cambium. We already talked about that in the last section. Vascular cambium is found between the xylem and the phloem, and as the primary root is expanding, it makes new xylem and phloem, but for the secondary structure, it's going to make what we call secondary xylem and phloem. These are going to be adding tissues to the xylem and phloem tissues. In particular, with the xylem, it'll be in layers. The core cambium is going to be formed from the pericycle, and it is going to be making the periderm, which is going to include the core cambium, but it also includes cork and phyloderm. And it is going to fill out broken tissues. We're going to talk about why that is. And it will replace the epiderm, cortex, endoderm, and the pericycle, because the pericycle becomes the core cambium. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about how this works. This is just sort of a diagrammatic way that it works, and there's differences among species, how this would actually be laid down exactly. But this is just sort of to give you a visualization. Now, this is harder to do 2D than it actually is 3D, but it's also fairly hard to do even 3D. So it's kind of like, learning how to ride a bike. Once you get it, it's sort of obvious, but otherwise it's a little difficult. Okay, so let's say this is the first year xylem. Remember, it was like in a little star shape in the middle of the plant, and the vascular cambium was between the xylem and the phloem of the first year's growth. So what happens is, let's say the first year, the vascular cambium, which is shown here in red, is going to add new xylem material towards the inside. So when it does that, it's going to add a layer on the outside of the primary xylem. All right? And when it does that, it also pushes out the initial phloem, right? And the phloem was maybe in these green little spots here. Now, when it pushes out that initial phloem, then it's going to actually make sort of gaps then in the tissue, that is in terms of the phloem tissue, which gets filled in by the secondary phloem. So after a few years, it's going to just be a layer, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, also imagine what is happening to the pericycle, endoderm, cortex, and epiderm. They are also being pushed out and broken up. All right, so to explain that maybe a little bit better, I'll just show you, like if I had a rubber band. So here's a rubber band, hard to do on the video here. If I have a rubber band, of course, it's elastic and it'll stretch. So this is the epiderm and such, and it would stretch. But if I just have something that is not stretchy, what's going to happen is it breaks. It falls on the floor. So it's going to break up. The layers out here are going to all break up, and they have to be filled in by some tissue. Now, in this case, it's going to be the pericycle that's filling that in. And every time it breaks up a little bit more, so as we get older and older and expand more and more and more, there's more tissue that has to be filled in, and so ultimately that pericycle becomes a meristematic layer called the core cambium that is making a layer just inside of it called the phyloderm, a layer on the outside of it, cork, which is dead tissue, and we talked a little bit about that before. Okay, so anyway, let's say this was the primary xylem. The second year was this one. The third year was this one. Fourth, fifth. So we're on the 6th year. So back to talking about xylem just a little bit. The xylem, remember, is only functional when it's newly dead. So this would be the functional xylem right here. These are all supportive xylem cells. Remember, they have secondary cell walls. and they may be filled with resins and other kinds of stuff that will help be part of its support system. So that all of that internal part then is dead tissue, and it's supportive of the new tree that we're basically drawing here. Now this layer is the vascular cambium. Remember, that's adding on new phloem. And towards the outside, remember, the phloem is being broken up. So let's say the first year's phloem was the green, and then the second year was like the blue, and the third year was like the black. Eventually, what's getting replaced by the vascular cambium here is just any gap in the phloem. And so it ends up being a very small, narrow layer just outside the vascular cambium. And then outside that is the pericycle doing the same thing, making the periderm. So what you get then is a situation that looks like this. Now bark, literally speaking, is anything from the vascular cambium outward. And so it is going to include the phloem, and then the cork, the pheloderm, cork cambium, and cork. And by the way, the one that is the most internal is this year's cork cambium and pheloderm and cork. Previous years are getting pushed out as they are made, so that's why bark usually looks kind of broken up, and that part can break up and actually fall off. You might have peeled bark off a tree if you were standing next to it or something like that. So anyway, those are the older layers on the very outside. The most newer layers are inside towards the phloem. So the living part of the bark, which is going to be the phloem, the pheloderm, and this year's cork cambium, are called the inner bark. And the outer layers of the bark, which are the dead layers, are previous year's cork cambium and cork, this year's cork, and all the previous year's cork cambiums and cork layers. So that's all the outer, very most outer parts. Now you might remember that if you, or maybe you don't know this, but if I were to girdle a tree, what that means is I come in and I cut off the bark all the way to the vascular cambium. And what's that do? It cuts off the phloem, and the phloem is what is transporting the sugars that are made in photosynthesis to the roots. And what would happen is that would kill off the roots of the plant. So in this case, we're talking about a root, but if I were to do that at the top root, like the tap root at the very top near the soil, then that would kill the rest of the roots below that. All right, so just so you know. Okay, just why are those layers formed on the xylem? Let's just kind of look at that for a second. What happens is that early in the year, the vessels that are laid down are big, are large. And as the season wears on, they get smaller and smaller because it's either hotter or there's less nutrients or whatever. And then it stops growing for the year, and then the next year it will have more, another layer that has big vessels at the beginning and smaller through the season. And then the next year would be big vessels at the beginning, etc. So that's why you see these as layers. Okay, this is just a depiction of kind of outside the vascular cambium. I'm going to have then a layer of phloem that's very thin, and then my pericycle is going to replacing all the broken tissues, and it's going to become the cork cambium, which is going to then make the periderm.